to the agenda. Right. So next on our agenda is the consent agenda. Ready? Yeah, we got an announcement. Just waiting for a couple of directors. Yes, we are. Sorry. Is everything okay?
Acronyms get us.
Okay, so we moved on to the consent agenda.
Yep.
Is there a motion to approve?
So moved.
Is there a second?
Second.
Okay, discussion, questions?
I have two. One is on the yearbook, and I had said some questions to the three people who were on listing that, and the reason why I had asked those questions was it was just unclear to me that the $205,000, when I first read it, the $205,000 was going to be spent on yearbooks, and if that was like out of the general fund or a new amount. And then I had asked the question, and that was clarified that that is coming from the ASB, it's reimbursed, and that's just an amount that's spent, but it's not out of the general fund, so it's not in some sense crowding out other kinds of uses in the spending of the fund. So I had that clarified, but if the minutes can reflect, just to make sure that we know that the $205,000 is not coming from the general fund, because that was a concern that I had. The second item was on the minutes of the meeting, the general meeting. And near the end, when we were talking about the internal auditor, we had decided, I went back and looked at the video because we had an exchange. I was just trying to make sure where we were at on that. And we had decided to put that into the June meeting. And I think it would be useful for the minutes to show that, because I think it was consensus, but we kind of made that choice. So just so the minutes track what we actually decided. Does that make sense, first off?
Does make sense.
Then what would be the process to make sure that do we have to just amend the minutes with one sentence that the board decided to discuss this at the June budget meeting, or I can't remember exactly, and maybe we just pull the minutes on that and just do the one sentence amendment. I'm not exactly sure the best way to do that, but I think it would be useful to have the minutes reflect the decision that we made.
Yeah, if there's a unanimous consent of the board, we could simply approve the consent agenda. Absent those minutes, we'll get them amended and then bring them back for approval at the May 24th meeting. The budget meeting, I'm a bit confused. The budget meeting is actually July, so I'm a bit confused about the date.
Was it after June? That's what I was trying to think.
The meeting where, unless there's a different meeting that you're thinking of, the meeting where we present the proposed budget for 2016-17 is traditionally the July meeting. We have a single meeting in July and the main focus is budget. So I don't know if there's trying to look at the June meetings and see if they're listed on my calendar, what we have as topics for those.
Is this going to be part of a study session before the budget?
Well,
I just wanted to make sure that the proposal, because I had brought an amendment and then I had changed it because there was one of the bullet points had not been clarified, and in the clarification which I sent out to the rest of the board, I think there's 4 different times we've already talked about this. So to make sure that we get it discuss it for this year's budget, and so I want to make sure that the minutes reflect that we have decided at some date certain to discuss it for this year's budget.
is there agreement amongst the board to amend the minutes to reflect that? Because I believe that's what.
I think the superintendent is asking the question, is there a time, because if that postpones the decision for this year's budget, then I need to come back to it, because I was under the understanding that we were going to talk about that for this year's budget, because the board was going to discuss that.
So just looking at the calendar, so the budget meeting traditionally is in July. There is an open, what I show on my calendar, and I don't have the board planner in front of me, so my calendar may not be accurate. What I show on my planner is an open study session on June 7th. My calendar does not show a topic there. That doesn't mean that there isn't one. Nothing's coming to my mind right now. Obviously, you'll be knee-deep in the middle of superintendent search at that point in time, so. Oh, here's. I don't have the.
So, yeah, the June 7th study session is open at this point, and it would, if I might make a procedural suggestion, when we go through our board retreat next year, going through the self-assessment as a board and starting to talk about planning for next year, I believe it would be a great time to start talking about some of the structural questions about your proposal, some of the corollary questions that it brings up again. But we do have that study session open, which, as Larry points out, it's a strategic point of time that I'm kind of keeping open. So, but I believe there was consensus, to bring this back full circle, to talk about it no later than the budget meeting as it's formally proposed to us in July. But
So yeah, I'm just trying to amend the minutes is the one thing,
Exactly.
but then
Right.
to that point, and we can maybe go back and look at it, but my understanding is we have a consensus to address it so that it can be talked about, because it has been brought up since August, and at several different times.
So just to clarify, the request is to amend the minutes to reflect the fact that we would be incorporating the discussion of an internal auditor into the budget conversation in July.
I think the minutes should reflect what happened. We've got the video, and then
I
when we come back next time to make sure that that goes into our budget process. So, and if we could talk, because we have a budget item here, and I have
Right.
additional questions about that. So I think right now, we're just talking about whether the minutes need to be amended, and I believe they do, to reflect what we did last time.
Which is what I was trying to sum up.
Okay, I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, that's cool, that's cool. So in terms of what I was trying to sum up, so, and just to gather this conversation, the amendment to the minutes would be to reflect the fact that the board reached consensus to discuss internal auditor within the budget meeting in July. There was other discussion in terms of other places to discuss it and other means to, but that doesn't need to be reflected in the minutes.
Would
Am
it
I
be,
reflecting it correct?
that's the way I recall it, but would it be sufficient just to amend the minutes to say there was board consensus to discuss the internal auditor for the 2016-17 budget cycle?
There you go.
Okay,
Yeah,
we will,
that's the sense of what we got.
yeah, yes, I think that captures the spirit of it. We will amend the minutes to that effect, and we will bring the April 26th minutes back on May 24th for approval then.
Thank you. No further discussion from Director Smith.
All right, any other questions or discussions on the consent agenda from the board? Seeing none, I will call for a vote. Great, and the agenda passes unanimously. Next up is action item number 11 on the agenda is the third reading of board policy number 2151, interscholastic athletics and activities. Is there a motion to approve?
Moved.
Any second?
Second.
Any discussion, questions?
Thanks to everyone for their very hard work on this policy, and hopefully this calls it good for a while.
Yeah, and I would just like to recognize and acknowledge particularly Heather and Chris, who spent quite a bit of time on this, and working with a variety of stakeholders.
Thank you, Bob, for coming to speak tonight on the subject. Appreciate it. Any other comments or discussion? All right, seeing none, I'm going to call for a vote. I don't see one coming through from Sandy.
I clicked it, but I did one.
Oh, there it goes.
Okay.
All right, thank you, and that passes unanimously. Next on the agenda is the second reading of Board Policy Number 2409, World Languages Credit for Proficiency. Is there a motion to approve?
So moved.
Any second?
Second it, please.
Any questions or discussion? Right,
So-
seeing none? Oh, did I interrupt you?
No, I just said I'm so excited. It's
Yeah.
fantastic. Thank you.
I concur. Very, very excited. Thank you very much for this. Okay, I'm going to call for a vote then. All right, that passes unanimously. Next item on the agenda is an action item, the program and staffing enhancements for 2016-17. Oh no, I skipped one. I so apologize. I'm on number 13, not 14. So number 13 is second reading of board policy numbers 8360, property records, 9300, school facilities, 7425, financial management, allowable costs for federal programs, and 7420, financial management, federal accounts and financial management. Is there a motion to approve?
So moved.
Any second?
Second.
Okay, any questions, points of discussion? Seeing none, I will call for a vote. That passes unanimously. Now, next item on the agenda. Excuse me, number 14, program and staffing enhancements for 2016-17. This is an action item. Is there a motion to approve?
So moved.
Any second?
Second.
Any questions or discussion?
Yeah, so I have some concern about when and how we make our budget decisions, and that if we make these decisions now, and I understand through other communications that some of these allow the staff to begin movement, but that if we make these decisions now, that we take other budget flexibility in some sense off the table. And so, and I believe that it would be useful to have some budget flexibility. I know that the Kenmore City Council uses a strategic opportunities fund. They actually move part of their general fund resources into a fund, and then they replenish it over time. And I think that we have some idea about, and I believe we think about this a little bit through the transition funding that we have for the Big Bang year that's coming up. We also have, the plans to bring on a new superintendent and other kinds of changes. And so this notion of a strategic opportunities fund, which is, basically some fund balance like you have in your general fund, is one of the ways that organizations in this area have created some budget flexibility for opportunities and issues that they would like to do. So I remember we received this early on in the process, but I'm concerned that if we pass this, it really doesn't give us any flexibility, additional board guidance for the budget. So I'm kind of wondering what other folks are thinking.
Board members have any thoughts? Is that, would that be a question you'd like perhaps
So,
Lydia or
Well,
someone to
let me
weigh
say
in
it a
on,
different way.
or-
I would be happy to propose having $1 million put into a strategic opportunities fund in the budgeting process, earmarked for future opportunities that the board and or the new superintendent would have to use when they come up to various opportunities that come about during the year. Because I think by voting for these and not giving ourselves any flexibility, we run into a difficulty. So and I know we haven't had a chance as a board to talk about this because of how other things have unfolded on the budget. And I know that these are thoughtful things that have been vetted by the administration, but the board hasn't necessarily weighed in and said, here's the things that we want other than by setting our policies. So I'm just concerned when we haven't really reached out to any kind of participatory way with the community on how to spend the money. So I'm just uncomfortable and adding $1 million. And of course, we have to propose or vote on the final budget, and we could make changes at any point in time. But as Principal Ziz talked about, the staff and everyone else needs decisions so they can start making. So when we do this, we're as if approving these budget items even before we've done the final approval. So I'm uncomfortable about that. And an offset of like $1 million in a strategic opportunities fund or looking towards that would give me less discomfort, I guess.
So I can just, Cindy, if you want to highlight or project this, so perhaps folks can see a little bit what we're talking about. Part of the challenge is if you look at any number of the items on here, well, I would take the second item, for example, the MSOC, material supplies and operating cost increase for our elementary schools. And we've had quite a bit of discussion around that. I think we've actually tried to reassure our parent communities that we're going to taper back the requests that we provide for providing classroom supplies. But this is an example of one of these items that's kind of ended up in sort of this limbo place that, principals, obviously parent community now has an expectation of what they're not going to be asked to provide. Principals are trying to plan for their budgets for next year, and so having uncertainty about that doesn't help with that quite a bit. Another good example on there would be the diversity and equity. And that $150,000, we don't necessarily have a defined plan for that $150,000.
That was one of my questions. What was the plan?
Well, yeah, so we have lots of different ideas, but not knowing what budgetary resource we have to work with, we would scale our plans according to whatever budget resource. So $150,000 is what we think is a sufficient amount of money to continue with training or to sustain our diversity equity initiative, perhaps to become a partner organization into a larger community initiative. So it could likely go in many different directions, and we haven't clearly defined that yet, but it's hard to begin to clearly define it until we know what resource base we're able to work with. So, these all to a certain extent fall into that category. I understand your concern about perhaps losing some kind of budget flexibility. The nurses are ones that are just sort of a response to increased needs that we've heard about at different times throughout the year. The athletics and activity directors at the bottom of the page, increasing those to 1.0 positions, reflects the continued transition of junior high sports to high school level competition, how that's impacting the workload of our athletic directors. It also impacts buildings, because if their athletic directors aren't going to be full-time in those positions, then they need to be slotted into teaching positions part of the day. So there's unfortunately timeliness and complexity around many of these items that sort of a opportunity fund with no sort of item-specific clarity doesn't necessarily address those timeliness issues.
Yeah, and I agree, and as we have been advised on this, okay, so I'm seeing one of them has the total of 960,000. Oh, because I've got, on one page I've got one screen and the other one has.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Oh, no, it's fine, it just,
Stop moving.
That's the total.
Right. That's what I thought, because I was adding up in my head this first page, it's like, that's the news about it. So then I'm looking at the budget report from last time, which has our general fund balance moving around, and we have been advised on that and understand the amounts that are there. And it's plus or minus then, 11 to 20-ish million, maybe a little bit more. And so this notion of an opportunity fund of moving or at least thinking about moving, it's not binding, $1 million of our general fund to a strategic opportunities fund, and then that would be replenished after you spend that. So in mid-year, the board has the discretion for that. Is I think the addendum I would like to make for this. Is it clear to the board what I'm asking or not?
It is, and I think it touches on what I hope was a goal for us at our board retreat with our setting our goals for next year and our long-term planning is creating the budget and community involvement. And I think that is probably a more appropriate place for that conversation of how we as a board bring additions to the budget, how community gets involved. I think that should be part of that conversation. As far as this goes, I look at most of these things are board directed. The MSOC increase definitely came from us, from our task force, obviously, diversity and equity, nurses, librarians, communication specialists. We didn't say this specific dollar amount, but those are all things that we as a board have said these are priorities for us, and we want to make sure that they're increasing and we're supporting for next year. So we did have a say, it just doesn't always, it's hard to connect the dots, and we can certainly talk about how to make that clear. So I am having trouble finding anything in here that I don't want to move forward with as of right now.
I think you brought up a good point. You actually hit on it, Sandy, before I was going to say it, so it's good that we're thinking the same way. And I think, can you bring up a point that I feel like I've been bringing up since I've been here for 2 years? So I think there's kind of two things going on here. Sandy, you said many of these are board directed, and I would agree with you. I would say, at least since I've been here, there's probably 2/3 on here. The increase in nurses, we've had our community say that, and the MSOC for sure was a huge thing for our community and the board. So I think it would be good to highlight those, because in this area I can see that the community has had some input into this. It's just we don't formalize, and I think that's where this confusing area comes in for me, and potentially comes in for the community is, we were listening with the mosque money. Now, I don't know that we put all of the increase towards there. That is a different question, which I wanted to ask. But we are trying to alleviate our student supplies. So if we could have a better process, Larry, and turning this over to probably to you, is a better process for being able to kind of mirror where the board has had input. But I do agree with Ken too, is that there are many times I feel like things are kind of budgeted here or there, and it's not maybe always board director, or there's not the flexibility in it, or for example, the struggling learners, where are we putting that money, and I don't get clarity where that's going, and we keep saying that's a board goal, and I'm not saying we're not putting money there, I'm saying I don't see some of that, and that's where I have some of the same.
If I can, before the superintendent would respond, I think adding in columns on this, they're already there implicitly, and then I'll basically retract the motion or the discussion move forward, is I think it is true that most of these, and we could just almost even have the dates in which we talked about that at the board, and the board performance measure that these relate to, because I think they do, and I've actually pulled out the performance measure, I just think trying to be more linkage into that and intentional, and that, and then when we say, okay, we really care about the achievement gap, okay, how much of this or whatever it is that we choose to care about, and I think that process is at that, but I just want to keep our mind on it to continually think about how to do it, and I agree with the point about making sure the community sees that as you came and talked to us about these things, the board heard you, and then in consultation with the staff, and the staff proposal back to the board, as the board said, yeah, we care about that too, and then here's the response to that, and I think that does leave both transparency and responsiveness, maybe adding those two columns of when the board talked about it, and also which performance measure it relates to. And I think that will help us get better clarity and make that budgeting process better. And we're incrementally moving there, I think, in a reasonable way.
And I think we can see the areas that we're hitting and the areas that maybe we didn't, that the board has said, hey, we want to see more funding in this, or we want to see this. And that might make it more clear. I like being more specific.
Director Smith has no more discussion.
Okay, I told Director Kogan I have no ego on this. So under classified support, 6.5 HR nurse at COS. What is COS?
That's Sorensen. Theo Sorensen.
Oh, there's a C there. I was like, okay, thank you, got it, I'm good. figure out where the C came from.
So I do have a question about that, and you may have told us this before, but it's not able to pull it from my memory right now. The mosque increase, how, yeah,
So-
I call it mosque.
Yeah, so the
Mosque.
So in the 2015-17 biennial budget, there was a fairly significant increase in MSOC funding. We still spend more in MSOCs, so in material supplies and operating costs as a district. We still spend more than we receive in state funding. So it's another one of those sort of semantic definitions that the legislature would use to say we are now fully funding MSOCs. And on their definition, they are. The reality is based on what we spend on MSOCs, we still expend more than what the state provides us. And so that, that balance comes out of local levy funding or redistribution of other resources within the budget.
So my specific question was, this year, we received a substantial increase, correct? And so how much of the increase that we received this year did we actually put back into this supply purchase versus, I mean, if we got a 10% increase, did we take half and use that to pay salaries or whatever, and then only half we?
Probably the better way to look at it would be what did the delta between state funding and our actual MSOC expenditures, how did it change? Do you know that off the top of your
I
head?
haven't done it for a few years, but the delta used to be that we were 4 million using levy, and that state increase has substantially narrowed that gap substantially so that we no longer have to use our local levy to pay our utility bills, because that's an MSOC. So the state was underfunding us, and we were having to pay for technology and utilities. Utilities is not something that's supposed to come out of your levy, and that freed up the levy for other purposes, which purposes that the levy was voted on.
You don't have.
I don't have a
the
specific
quick off the
dollar
top of your
amount.
head.
And then I just do have a question about the increase for recruitment materials, advertising, job fairs. Were we not doing that before? Are we having that much of an increase, or are you just reallocating monies?
We are actually looking to enhance our efforts as the labor market gets tighter. So we do currently have budget and expend monies on those activities. We're recognizing that there's, particularly next year, there's going to be a run on kindergarten teachers across the state. And so we're likely going to need to enhance our recruitment efforts, perhaps attend job fairs in other parts of the state or other parts of the country that we don't currently attend in order to fill all of our positions.
So I'm going to get us back to the question. So, in terms of your request, Ken, to add additional information to tie the items into board goals and board initiatives, is that a request in terms of timeline you were making, were you proposing that change happen and having another reading of the program enhancer, just asking for it as an informational item?
Just as we move forward, like perhaps put that in the board briefing, but do not want to stop action on this particular item.
I do want to make, do we as a board agree, or do we have to take action on it? I mean, we don't have to take action on something like that, right? You can just change it.
For the report, we can ask for another. So any other points or questions, points of discussion on this item before we take a vote?
We just add, I think it's one of our most important duties as the board to pay attention and talk about and discuss the budget and to include our stakeholders, all of our stakeholders in that discussion as much as possible. So I thank the board for taking the time to have this additional discussion.
All right, I'm going to call for a vote. And that item passes unanimously. Next item on the agenda is the first reading of the Enrollment Demographics Task Force recommendation. So this is going to be the subject of our study session. As soon as this meeting is done, we're going to move on to the recommendation. you know, a first reading of a recommendation like this is an opportunity for board members to ask questions. But again, we're going to have another opportunity here in just a few minutes.
Just gonna ask that how come did we do this backwards again? You might have explained it to me, but.
So we have a timeliness issue around this on a couple of fronts. One is if the board endorses the recommendation because of the complexities of developing the multi-site, we're feeling like we need to begin expediting actual design and permit work in order to make a 2020 timeline for opening up a facility on that particular site. There's also, as we'll talk about in the study session, some considerations around the Snohomish County update to our capital facilities plan and our ability to begin to collect impact fees. And part of, we believe we may have hit that threshold where we can collect impact fees, but unfortunately you can only collect impact fees if you have an approved project that's intended to address your capacity needs. And so obtaining board approval of the recommendation to move forward, so there is a defined project, and the update to Snohomish County is due in June. So that puts an added time pressure on gaining approval on the EDTF recommendation for the 2020 multi-site.
Why? What has changed that we can now collect impact fees potentially?
Some change in calculation, but more than anything else, just continued enrollment growth. I mean, we're growing an elementary school a year, and so from the last time we've updated, we've continued to grow at that level.
I guess I'm confused though, because I've heard numerous times that we had to get capacity at the east side of our district a certain percentage, and just a recent report we got said we weren't there, so.
So it's based on a district-wide percentage, so we can explain more about that in the study session.
That's what's here.
Yeah.
Have this first then.
So I have questions, but
So I do apologize, this is in a bit of a backward order from what our typical process would be, but this is a significant decision that is a two-reading type decision.
And thank you for that. And then in terms of the recommendation, how much specificity would we need in that project approval in order to qualify?
Nothing more than what's in the recommendation you have before you.
So something like we're approving the 24-room addition here and a 600 to 700 student. So what would be approved? And then if project changes needed to be made, as almost always happens in construction, that doesn't change essentially if we're close to that.
I don't believe so.
Okay.
You could answer my question too that I just asked, since I'm reading it now.
We would just be required to have an approved project in our capital facilities plan that addresses the capacity deficiency, in our case at elementary. So it would need to be defined enough that it lists the number of seats, the capacity that it's adding. And then we're also required to include a financing plan in our capital facilities, so we need some kind of cost estimate for that project. But you're right, it's an estimate, things change, and it is the plan. But we would have to be able to have the project defined enough that we knew where it was being built, how many seats, the grade level, and an idea of the cost.
While you're still here, Karen, I have a question. If this is more appropriate or part of the agenda you had planned for the study session, feel free to defer it. So it does help me to understand with greater clarification the process of, we had in June our initial initiation as a board to explore this. We have this next step, and then it goes to the Capital Projects Task Force, just understanding how this is building and how the trigger points interact with each other.
Sure, so I think as Superintendent explained, we're at a little bit of a unique crossroads given that Snohomish County does their capital facility plan updates every 2 years. So this is a moment where the timing has lined up well for us, given that based on our enrollment growth projections, we are eligible for elementary level impact fees. We're still not at the secondary level. Also aligning with that is the fact that EDTF is bringing you a recommendation to construct potentially elementary capacity on the Maltby site. We know we have to have a project in our plan to be eligible to collect the fees, so that helps. At that point, this project would get more defined after board approval. The project itself would get more defined, and we would have something to be able to refer then to the Capital Bond Planning Task Force in the fall. They would use that information along with all the other facility assessment information that we're gathering. I think I've mentioned that before, that we're expecting that report back in June. And they would be able to use this project plus that information to balance what they're going to recommend to the board for the 2018 bond. So does that answer
Yeah,
your
no, that
question?
absolutely does. Thank you so much.
Karen, I was just curious, does Snohomish County look at it by the school is located in the county or the population of the families are in the Snohomish County?
The calculation is all done district-wide based on the district's geographic boundaries. So each of our jurisdictions adopts our capital facilities plan in their own timeline in a slightly different way. But they all look at geographic boundaries of the school district for both our capacities as well as our enrollment projections.
So is the ability to collect these impact fees going to change in other counties? King, I guess we only have King, the other county.
The plan is universal, for lack of a better word. It would be, each jurisdiction would have to adopt it, and that's their process and their purview. But the plan is one plan, and it's one eligibility that we need to meet. So if we meet the eligibility for elementary school to collect impact fees, we'd be collecting them district-wide as long as every jurisdiction has adopted our plan and implements our fee.
You guys are going to talk about how this changed?
Yes.
Okay.
Any other questions?
I think we're anxious for this day.
I think we're looking forward to
Yeah.
it. Thank you very
Move
much,
on.
Karen. All right. So then the next information item on the agenda is the district budget status report for March. Do any board members have any questions regarding this?
I just have a quick comment, is that, and we'll talk about it from the debrief on the Bothell City Council meeting, which was fabulous for so many different reasons. But one of the items that they had talked about was being interested in the aquatic center, and that they have the chair of the North Shore Parks and Recreation Service Area, which is essentially the same footprint as the school district, was interested in doing that and working through the processes of finding that. So when we look at the budget status report, especially our capital projects fund, thinking about and a good bit of the money that's in the fund balance in the capital projects fund came from the sale of the Anderson property, which turned into McMenamins, which also had some swimming facilities. So the board can think about and talk about that, but I think it's just important to keep that top of mind if that money would come from, if that moves forward in the next year or three, that we could maybe have some cash on hand that's available for that, or that could be bonded, or that could be bonded by a different jurisdiction through some kind of a joint agreement. So just keeping that in mind when we think about our money, that there's some financing capacity there if we were to choose to go down that path.
We know it. I personally would want to investigate, since that sale happened a while ago, that those funds might have already been allocated to other projects. But you raise a good point about the sale of the property, and when we go down any conversations about the aquatic center, we can definitely look into that. Any other questions about the status report? Right. So we will move along to the first reading of the middle school academics program recommendation. Just a point of clarification, this is the first reading of the recommendation. The vote will be happening as if we follow the schedule the next board meeting in 2 weeks. This is an opportunity for board members to ask questions, discuss amongst ourselves. It's an opportunity to vet some ideas. We just recently had the study session. Just, if any board members have any thoughts or questions, if you'd like to pose them, feel free.
Definitely appreciate the extra time in the study session. Thank you to staff for making that time available.
Thank you again to the board members for their individual schedule ability. It's been a busy spring, and I just want to say, as I'm planning meetings, I really appreciate everyone's flexibility around these meetings.
I actually have a process question that the president had asked at the beginning of our study session. I thought was really useful, and it kept my brain going. And then the vice president had also brought up some concerns that helped me to think. In some ways, I could see us having 3 votes in sequence, because I think there's multiple issues on the table. And so I wrote them down as possible motions and in order. So one question is whether or not the board feels like the report and the task force followed district policy. And I believe that there have been citizens have brought that forth to us. The vice president brought it forth to us. And it is my sense as of right now that we did not follow our board or district policy, and that creates a problem for accepting the report. And I think there's concerns about accepting a report that had so many policy, not following the policy. So that's one. A second motion would be to create a task force for moving forward. And so I had looked at not only policy 4200, which I think is the most significant policy that the task force did not follow from start to finish, but the policy 2020, which is on curriculum design. I don't know if we could pull that up, because I think there was a piece there that I would like to bring everyone's attention, because I want us to be able to take action on it, and that's why I think it's good to get a feel for that. So can the person running the screen pull that up so the board can see policy 2020? Okay, so this is about the curriculum and instructional design, and then if we go down to course design, it says it's the process, I think it's on the second page. There's the definition, but keep going down if you could.
Course design.
Under the definition.
Keep going under the definitions, course design, right. The superintendent designee will establish procedures for course design that, bullet point 1, provide for the regular review of selected content areas and implementation of any suggested change, provide for involvement of community representatives and staff members at appropriate times. And so combined with policy 4200, which basically says the community can and should be involved as we go through that process, as I read policy 2020, it would seem to me that the appropriate time for the course design, no matter whether the board selects option 1 or option 2, that there would be significant involvement. And I believe that there's lots of different views on this particular topic, and I think we need to move together forward as a community, no matter what is chosen. And this is different than the adoption of materials. As I read policy 2020, the policy materials, instructional materials are given, the teachers are given the primary role for selecting instructional materials. And I think that's in this policy earlier. I think that's appropriate. But I think the course design, because a large part, I think, of the community's concern is how are these courses actually going to be designed and delivered. We already in policy have a mechanism for that. So the second motion I think I would be comfortable with us taking is to design a balanced task force for the implementation of course design that follows this part of policy 2020. And that, of course, will have to evolve over time, and we have to work that out. But to be very cognizant and clear that for the community members, no matter which one is going to be implemented, that there will be significant involvement in the course design of our middle school curriculum. And then the third item would be sort of simply the up or down vote, I think, on, we may or may not have amendments, but on options 1 or 3. So just to review, I believe we should have, I would like us to rank these as 3 motions. The first one being whether or not to accept the report as having followed district policy. The second one being to create a balanced task force for implementation following procedure 4200 and 2020 related to course design. And then third, a motion on option 1 or 3. So that's my thinking, and I'd like to take your comments off the air.
So, I want to remind the board that I brought up at one of our superintendent decision, where we were hammering out the superintendent search process. I made a motion at that time to suspend hiring. And David, you had said to me, we can't do that, or we need to look at our policy. And pretty much there was this, not complete consensus, but we need to follow our policies, that we can't just make decisions. And then, I'm not just trying to single you out, but a couple of you brought me, said that you would find the policy, and a couple administrators said, no, we need to follow the policy, and, wanted to handed that to me, and that's what, eventually I went, okay, that's our policy. And so I want to remind the board of that, because this is the same situation from my view, is that, and I brought this up at our study session, but I do want to bring it forth again and have it where we also have our community members here that weren't able to attend that. And also I'd like these in the next board briefing. Our policy 4200, as Ken stated, this is our policy about shared decision making, and I'm not going to go through reading all of this, but if anyone wants to look them up, and I would appreciate, like I said, us having these in the board meeting. We've done this well on our EDTF task force, and we're doing this well, not that we don't have room for improvement, but I think we're doing this well so far on our start time task force, and we might find out that we need to adjust and improve things, but I don't believe that we have followed this policy, this community relations, the way it's laid out.
So can I ask for a clarification then, particularly around the notion of forming another task force? So there has been a task force that has operated for 3 years. There's actually been 3 task forces that have operated for 3 years that have were permissioned by action of the board, that have included parents, community members, staff, administrators. So I'm curious as to how that process that the board approved at the time, albeit 3 years ago, but that's been in operation, isn't in compliance with 4220.
So to go to that, so 4200, one of the biggest, of course. So a concern is the first concern is just the delegation of the task force. The current report says that it came from the board president, and if it came from the board president, it should come from the board as a whole. The board president doesn't have that power.
And it just for clarification, it did.
It did or did not?
It did.
Come from the board president?
It came from board action. I believe what that's referring to is after the board action, when the task force was first formed, the board president at the time met with the task force in their very initial meetings and articulated the action of the board and the work they would be completing. But that scope of work was endorsed and approved by the entire board.
And really quick, that's where I do have the discrepancy, because I keep hearing that the board said, look at heterogeneous classrooms, when the board at the time was saying that they wanted challenge and had a unanimous decision in that. And so I do take a little bit of discrepancy, not with you, but with that language that I'm hearing, because if one board member albeit the president, went and said, now, here are the specifics, and the board as a whole did not know those were the specific, that was the specific direction. And I'm not sure, I wasn't sitting here 3 years ago, but I know I was here 2 years ago when I, as a board member, voted self-select challenge in unanimously. So that seems very contradictory to me, that the board would direct that the district implement self-select challenge and yet has a opposite direction to the task force saying, look at heterogeneous classrooms and not evaluate self-select challenge. That doesn't, that's what and I can see the administration is not comfortable with what I'm saying, but that's what I heard, and I can only speak on what I heard as I'm watching everyone over there. So my concern is that there wasn't a directive to evaluate the program that we had along with looking at heterogeneous classrooms. That's my concern. And
Yeah, and whether or not that's a violation of policy, I didn't go through to get that concern, but I share that concern. The one on shared decision-making, it's the second paragraph says, shared decision-making is a process that requires a climate of openness, trust, respect for diversity. All parties must commit to the use of shared decision-making in order to foster full participation and genuine involvement of, and then the following, administrators, teachers, classified staff, specialists, parents, community members, and students. And so we have heard through today that in the operation of the task force, and those of us who've looked at it and gathered evidence, that the community members, parents, and students were not afforded full participation and genuine involvement. There was perhaps an appearance of that, and then there was also action by the board, and I've seen that evidence, and we can share that out where the concerns that had been raised were not attended to in terms of getting that participation. I believe, and I said this in the task force, I think it's very important that I think we're making progress in terms of understanding these issues. And I think that we are moving forward, but it was not directly or only because of the middle school task force. It was largely because the citizens had to self-structure themselves through Save Our Challenge to bring additional research, the research which the rigorous and emerging research does not support kind of the underlying middle school philosophy in every element of the work done by Oakes and Slavin and Hattie. And so when one side of the decision-making process says all the research supports this or not, it really doesn't. And the process, especially because the academic task force had 10 out of 17 people from one viewpoint. We have heard from 2 of the task force members saying that the minority opinion was pushed away and not involved. I think the evidence to me is such that we didn't follow the policy. We can vote that differently. I'm not saying that we'll get a unanimous vote or what, but I think it's appropriate for us to reflect, and I shared Vice President D'Angelo's view that our process in task force has worked well for EDTF, and I think we follow this, and it seems to be working on start time. On this one, I don't think it was, and I think there's plenty of evidence. I can compile that and put it together.
I would contend there are other factors that have contributed to what we might see as the success of the EDTF and the start time task force. And I would say the number one factor is I think that we avoided much of the politicization that has occurred around this particular process. And I think particularly at the board level, getting engaged at the time that the board did get engaged, while the task force was still in process, is very different than what happened with the EDTF process, and to date, what's happened with the Start Time Task Force process. So I think that created different access points for people to engage around the issue that went above and beyond the work that the task force was doing before they had even come forward with a recommendation.
And do you understand that there's a viewpoint that the reason why that engagement took place is because in October the board received a message that I just recently received that these viewpoints were not being heard and that there was not full engagement. So that's why I'm going to the policy, because I think the policy is really important yes, there was politicization of it because it appears from my reading of the factual evidence that the parents and the students and community members were not being given full participation and genuine involvement. And that the task force had a one-sided approach, and it came back with that approach. It's kind of the fruit of the poison tree was something that someone shared with me, that if you start off wrong or start off with, if you're to aim at that target, that's what you're going to hit, but you can't necessarily use that outcome because it's predetermined to get the outcome that you got. So I think I agree that there's a lot of viewpoints on this, but I don't think, my opinion, is that we follow policy 4200, and it's my preference that we would take a vote to see if we thought that we did, and then move on with the others.
So I have two thoughts. The first one is I'd like to point out that option 3 actually that we narrowed down to did come from the Save Our Challenge input. So that was something that was brought up, that it was an effort by, my understanding, again, I wasn't in the room, but it was definitely mentioned by task force members that option 3 that was presented in the recommendation was based off of very specific input from the Save Our Challenge group. And I believe that, and this is my second point, what I'm afraid of is to sit here as a board and go back and forth, point to point, what is the definition in hindsight, Monday morning quarterbacking, what is the definition of community involvement, and having we can have a vote definitely as a board to have policy discussion, but I'm just saying our job up to this point to listen to several points of input, including representative of the principals, we do have a responsibility to make a decision on the recommendation period. And I'm worried that if we have a conversation about did this happen, did that happen, where you could go, just like the research, I think it was you, Ken, who mentioned in the study session, there's research on either side. I also don't want to get to the point where we villainize people for having a different opinion than someone else. Yeah, and that's really, honestly, is what I'm the most afraid of, is I don't.
Happened on the task force.
Well, and so I think that definitely as a board, then we want to make sure to resist that temptation ourselves. It's one thing to have an evaluation of policy for sure. I'm just worried that this will turn into a quagmire if we start having this kind of discussion that starts to talk about process that, as a board, the board initiated the task force and then was not part of it until the recommendation came to us. And yes, we have a responsibility for protecting all voices in our district. Absolutely. Let me just finish a second. For protecting all voices, I got an email from a parent who was here at last meeting, and I wrote down this quote: "How can we all meet in service of the students without understanding one another?" So I just want to make sure that I'm more than willing, especially in my job, it's my job to facilitate the board to take votes on any motion if any motions are put forward. I just want to keep an eye on one, that we honor all voices, and that two, that we also keep an eye on our primary responsibility around this topic at this point in time, which in my view is making sure we get to the point of deciding on the recommendation.
So I had started bringing some policies up. I know Sandy wants to say something probably based on this. So
Are you, I guess what I'm trying to clarify is, are you addressing what Ken has brought forward, or are you?
I was addressing my own.
Okay.
Here's what
Just for my brain process.
he might have the same thoughts, but I don't.
So I'm just asking the board, are we going to address the 3 proposals Ken has brought forward and then you speak, or are you going to speak and then I have to remember what those were and we'll go back to those?
Okay. I get what you're saying.
Just trying to clarify where we're at.
So, well, let me then finish addressing that through this.
Okay.
Okay. you were not here, Ken, and you weren't here, David, but